There's something almost magical about standing in front of an ancient artwork, isn't there? Picture this: your eyes trace the curves of a fresco painted thousands of years ago. Its colors still vivid, its stories still alive. The figures seem to whisper across time, their triumphs and tragedies etched into every brushstroke. How did artists from civilizations long gone manage to capture such raw emotion, such divine grandeur, with nothing but pigments and their own hands? This isn't just about technique, it's about humanity itself. Across cultures and centuries, art has been our way of reaching beyond the ordinary, of grasping at something eternal. And today, we're going to unravel how they did it. Think about the last time a piece of art left you breathless. Maybe it was the sheer scale of an Egyptian tomb, its walls covered in hieroglyphs and scenes of the afterlife, each detail a promise of immortality. Or perhaps it was the haunting beauty of a Greek tragedy carved into marble, where every fold of fabric and curve of a face seemed to pulse with life. These artists weren't just decorating walls or shaping stone. They were capturing the essence of what it means to be human. They painted gods who walked among mortals, heroes who defied fate, and ordinary people whose sorrows and joys still resonate with us today. Their work wasn't just art, it was a language, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. So what was their secret? How did they transform simple materials into stories that outlasted empires? It wasn't just skill, though their craftsmanship was unparalleled. It was their understanding of symbolism, their deep connection to the myths and beliefs of their time, and their ability to infuse every stroke with meaning. From the sacred rituals of Mesopotamia to the dramatic theaters of ancient Greece, artists wielded their tools like storytellers, weaving narratives that transcended generations. And as we journey through these masterpieces together, you'll start to see the patterns, the shared human desire to make sense of glory, tragedy, and the mysteries beyond our world. This is more than a history lesson. It's a chance to walk alongside the artists of the past and see the world through their eyes. Ready to begin? Look closely at any ancient artwork, and you'll start to notice the hidden language woven into every detail. That lotus flower blooming in an Egyptian mural, it wasn't just a pretty design, it symbolized rebirth, emerging pristine from muddy waters just as the sun god Ra rose each dawn. Or take the intricate meander patterns on a Greek vase, those twisting lines mimicking the labyrinth of fate, reminding viewers that life's path was never straightforward. These artists weren't decorating, they were speaking in a code of symbols, a visual shorthand that carried the weight of entire belief systems. Consider the ankh, that looped cross held by pharaohs and gods in countless hieroglyphs. To modern eyes, it might seem like a simple charm, but to the Egyptians, it was the key to immortality, a promise that life didn't end at the grave. Even colors held power. Lapis lazuli blue wasn't chosen just for its beauty, but because it mirrored the heavens, making it sacred. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, artists embedded political messages into reliefs. A king depicted larger than his enemies wasn't just artistic license. It was propaganda, shouting his dominance without a single written word. But symbolism wasn't always grand or solemn. Sometimes it was playful, even subversive. On Athenian drinking cups, a painted scene of Dionysus might seem like a simple party motif until you realize the god's drunken revels were a warning about excess, hidden in plain sight between the wine and laughter. And in Minoan frescoes, leaping dolphins weren't just marine life. They symbolized the unpredictable sea, both life-giver and destroyer, a reminder of nature's dual power. What's fascinating is how these symbols traveled across cultures, morphing yet retaining their core meanings. The serpent, for instance, could be a protector on an Egyptian pharaoh's crown, a trickster in Mesopotamian myths, or a healer entwined around Asclepius's staff in Greece. The same motif but tailored to each civilization's fears and hopes. That's the genius of ancient artists. They took universal human questions and gave them local faces, turning abstract ideas into tangible forms that anyone, from a priest to a farmer, could recognize. So the next time you see an ancient artifact, don't just glance, pause. That decoration might be a whole story waiting to be read, because when an artist painted a falcon stretching its wings across a temple wall, they weren't just drawing a bird. They were capturing the soul of a god, the breath of the wind, the endless cycle of the sky. And suddenly, thousands of years later, you're not just looking at art, you're having a conversation across time. When you stand before the ruins of a Roman triumphal arch, you're not just looking at weathered stone, you're witnessing the echoes of an empire's roar. These colossal structures weren't built to be subtle. Take the Arch of Titus in Rome, where every carved scene of soldiers parading with menorahs wasn't merely decoration. It was psychological warfare in marble, broadcasting Judea's defeat to every citizen who passed beneath it. The artists who crafted these monuments mastered a delicate dance, capturing enough realism to feel convincing, while exaggerating just enough to inspire awe. Notice how Egyptian pharaohs were always depicted in their prime, muscles taut, faces serene, even if the ruler was elderly or frail in reality. That wasn't dishonesty, it was visual alchemy, transforming mortal leaders into living symbols of divine order. The Colossus of Rhodes perfectly illustrates this blend of artistry and messaging. Towering over the harbor at 33 meters tall, roughly the height of the Statue of Liberty's torch, this bronze titan wasn't just a tribute to the sun god Helios. Its very posture told a story, 1 foot planted on either side of the harbor entrance, not just physically straddling the waterway, but symbolically straddling the line between human achievement and celestial power. Though earthquakes eventually toppled it, the Colossus lived on in legends precisely because its creators understood something profound. True glory in art comes from speaking to both the eyes and the imagination. Roman sculptors took this concept further with their busts of emperors. Look closely at Augustus of Prima Porta, that iconic marble statue where the emperor's armor teems with allegorical figures. The artist didn't just carve a military leader, they wove an entire cosmology into the metal folds, personifications of conquered territories, gods nodding approval, even a Cupid riding a dolphin to hint at the Julian family's mythical descent from Venus. Every element served dual purposes, pleasing the viewer aesthetically while reinforcing political narratives. What's remarkable is how these techniques transcended cultures. In Persia, the monumental stairway reliefs at Persepolis showed subject nations bringing tribute, each figure's posture and garments meticulously differentiated to showcase the empire's vast reach. The Assyrians took a more visceral approach. Their palace walls featured lion hunt scenes where King Ashurbanipal's arrows always found their mark, a not-so-subtle reminder that challenging his rule was as futile as outrunning a speeding arrow. Perhaps the most fascinating twist comes from how these works played with perspective. Egyptian obelisks tapered slightly so they'd appear even more towering when viewed from below, an early form of forced perspective that made pharaohs seem to touch the sky. Greek sculptors employed contrapposto, that subtle weight shift in statues like the Doraphoros, making marble figures appear moments away from stepping off their pedestals. These weren't just technical flourishes, they were invitations for viewers to participate in the illusion of grandeur, to willingly suspend disbelief in service of something greater than themselves. The genius of these artists lies in their understanding that stone and bronze could never truly capture reality, so instead they captured aspiration. When we admire these monuments today, we're not just seeing what was, we're seeing what people longed to believe, what they needed to remember, and above all, what they dared to become. That's why these works still command our attention centuries later. They speak to the part of us that still wants to reach beyond our grasp. Greek artists painted tragedy with the same intensity they brought to celebrations because they understood something profound about human nature. Take the famous Exekia's vase, where Achilles and Ajax sit playing dice even as their armor hangs nearby, a quiet moment before they march to their deaths. The painter didn't show battle or blood. Instead, he captured the weight of impending doom in their bowed shoulders, the way their fingers hover over the game board like men already mourning their own futures. This was tragedy distilled to its essence, not spectacle, but the quiet anticipation of loss. Roman mosaics took a different approach. In the house of the tragic poet at Pompeii, a floor panel depicts a chained dog with the words, "Cave Canem, beware of the dog." At first glance, it's whimsical until you realize this home was frozen in ash during Vesuvius's eruption. That playful warning became a haunting premonition, a reminder that even mundane moments could turn tragic in an instant. Artists didn't just record suffering, they embedded it in everyday scenes, making grief feel intimate, inevitable. Then there's the Laocoon group, that masterpiece of writhing marble where every muscle strains against fate. The Trojan priest and his sons struggle with serpents, their faces twisted not just in pain but in revelation. Laocoon's wide eyes seem to understand his punishment for defying the gods is also a kind of brutal poetry. Hellenistic sculptors perfected this art of pathos, using exaggerated drapery and dynamic poses to pull viewers into the emotional whirlwind. Notice how the serpent's coils mirror the folds of Laocoon's robe, binding him physically and symbolically to his doom. But why depict such agony? Athenian potters painting scenes of fallen warriors weren't glorifying war, they were inviting viewers to confront loss collectively. When a mother in ancient Corinth traced her finger over a funeral crater showing mourners tearing their hair, she wasn't just seeing art, she was seeing her own grief reflected and validated. These works functioned like communal therapy, letting societies process trauma through symbolism. Even the colors spoke. The somber black figure technique of early Greek pottery gave way to red figure styles where negative space seemed to echo absence. The genius lies in balance. These artists never let despair overwhelm beauty. Look at the dying Gaul sculptures from Pergamon. A warrior slumps, blood pooling beneath him, yet his face is serene, his posture almost graceful. The message is clear: tragedy isn't the opposite of dignity. By freezing these moments in clay and stone, ancient creators gave suffering meaning, transforming raw pain into something that could be held, examined, and ultimately understood across centuries. That's their real legacy, not just showing us how people died, but reminding us how they lived. Ancient artists didn't just sculpt gods, they built bridges between heaven and earth. In Egypt, the jackal-headed Anubis wasn't some bizarre hybrid. His animal features were a visual language. That sharp muzzle symbolized his role as guardian of the dead, able to sniff out deceit in the underworld, while the human body kept him approachable enough to guide souls. Similarly, Hathor's cow horns cradling the sun disk weren't merely decorative, they embodied her nurturing power, merging the divine with the familiar sight of cattle that sustained daily life. This blending of realms was deliberate. By giving deities animal traits, Egyptian artists made the unknowable feel tangible, transforming cosmic forces into something you could almost reach out and touch. The Greeks took the opposite approach, yet arrived at the same destination. When Phidias sculpted Zeus at Olympia, he didn't add wings or extra limbs. He crafted the god as the ultimate human, every muscle and curl of his beard radiating perfection. But here's the genius: that flawless form wasn't meant to suggest gods were just like us. It implied humans could aspire to godhood. The contrapposto stance of Apollo statues, with their weight shifted casually onto one leg, didn't just showcase anatomical skill, it breathed arrogance into marble, capturing the effortless superiority of beings who'd never know fatigue or doubt. Even their flaws were theatrical. Ares might have a scar, but it only made him more dashing, turning violence into allure. Now look east to the dancing Shiva in Hindu bronzes, where multiple arms aren't a display of surrealism but a flowchart of divine activity. One hand holds the drum of creation, another the flame of destruction, while the remaining two offer blessings and point to liberation, cosmic functions made visible through anatomy. The rhythmic sway of these sculptures isn't just aesthetic, it mirrors the pulse of the universe itself, with each limb positioned according to sacred geometry. Unlike Greek idealism or Egyptian symbolism, this approach treats the body as a canvas for philosophy, where every curve and angle maps onto spiritual concepts. What unites these traditions is their shared understanding that divinity couldn't be captured literally. The Mesopotamian Lamassu, winged bulls with human faces, guarded palace gates, not as monsters but as living paradoxes, their hybrid bodies telegraphing that true power defies categorization. Even the Christian Byzantines, who later forbade graven images, initially portrayed Christ as a beardless youth in Roman tunics, adapting familiar iconography to make the unfamiliar divine feel intimate. Perhaps most telling are the exceptions. When Akhenaten broke from Egyptian tradition to depict Aten as a faceless sun disk with reaching rays, it wasn't abstraction for art's sake, it was a theological revolution, stripping away all anthropomorphism to emphasize a god beyond human comprehension. Yet even this radical move couldn't escape symbolism. Those rays ended in tiny hands because some connection to the human experience proved irresistible. That's the thread running through all these representations. The divine might be infinite, but art thrives on specificity. Whether through Horus' falcon eyes seeing all or Athena's owl-eyed wisdom, ancient artists knew that to make gods real, they had to give them something we could recognize not just in their features, but in the longings they reflected back at us. Because when you stand before a statue of Vishnu reclining on the cosmic ocean, you're not just seeing a god at rest, you're seeing how an entire civilization dreamed of eternity. Color wasn't just something ancient artists saw, it was something they felt in their bones. When an Egyptian artisan ground lapis lazuli into powder to create that radiant blue, they weren't just mixing paint, they were grinding pieces of the sky itself. This pigment, so costly it was reserved for depictions of gods and pharaohs, carried the weight of the cosmos in every stroke, but the symbolism went deeper than mere rarity. That celestial hue mirrored the Nile at dawn, the vault of the afterlife, and the skin of Amun-Ra, layers of meaning packed into a single pigment pot. Red ochre tells an equally profound story. Found in Paleolithic caves and Egyptian tombs alike, this earthy tone wasn't chosen for convenience. It pulsed with symbolism, the flush of lifeblood, the scorch of the desert sun, the fire of creation myths. In China, artisans mixed cinnabar into lacquer for ceremonial objects, its mercury-rich crimson representing both immortality and danger, a duality that fascinated alchemists for centuries. Even the black of Mesopotamian steels served a purpose beyond contrast. It evoked the fertile silt of the Tigris and Euphrates, tying rulers' declarations to the land itself. Byzantine mosaicists took this chromatic language to dazzling heights, walk into the Hagia Sophia and you're not just surrounded by gold, you're immersed in divine light. Those tiny tessera cubes weren't placed randomly. Their angles were calculated to catch candlelight, making Christ's robes shimmer as if touched by the supernatural. Notice how saints' halos often used green glass, a color associated with renewal in early Christianity, while the Virgin Mary's deep blue mantle echoed both royalty and the protective veil of night. Every hue was a theological argument in glass and stone. The technical mastery behind these colors is staggering. Egyptian blue, one of the first synthetic pigments, required heating sand, copper, and natron to nearly 1,000 degrees, a recipe so precise modern chemists struggled to replicate it. Maya blue, used in sacred murals across Mesoamerica, bonded indigo with rare clay minerals through a ritualistic process that may have involved sacrificial offerings. These weren't just paint formulas, they were alchemical secrets guarded as closely as temple mysteries. What's revelatory is how these color systems crossed cultural boundaries while retaining unique meanings. The purple extracted from Mediterranean sea snails symbolized imperial power in Rome, but in Japan, the same hue derived from Cromwell root adorned Buddhist mandalas as a sign of enlightenment. Yellow could represent Ra's golden bark in Egypt, the Earth's center in Chinese cosmology, or Judah's betrayal in medieval Europe, same pigment, radically different stories. This chromatic vocabulary reveals ancient artists as philosophers of perception. They understood color could bypass reason and speak directly to the soul. When a Moch potter in Peru painted sacrifices in bold red and white, or a Celtic metalworker inlaid enamel in swirling blues, they weren't decorating. They were encoding entire worldviews into visual frequencies. Their legacy reminds us that every color choice we make today is part of an unbroken conversation stretching back to when humans first realized certain hues could make the invisible feel tangible. Imagine working on a painting where every brushstroke was a prayer. That's exactly what ancient artists experienced when they created works meant not for admirers but for the divine. Deep in the caves of Lascaux, the flickering torchlight would have revealed bison and horses painted not as decorations, but as part of sacred hunts, rituals where capturing an animal's likeness was believed to grant power over it in the real world. These artists weren't just making art, they were performing a ceremony, their pigments mixed with intention, their hands guided by tradition. This sacred approach wasn't limited to prehistoric times. In ancient Egypt, temple artisans followed the canon of proportions, a strict mathematical system dictating how gods and pharaohs should be depicted. A statue of Osiris wasn't just a representation, it was a vessel for the god's presence, crafted according to rules so precise that even the angle of a finger carried meaning. Deviating from these guidelines wasn't considered creative freedom, it was sacrilege. The artist's role wasn't to innovate, but to channel the divine through flawless repetition. Hindu temple sculptors took this concept even further. Carving a deity like Shiva Nataraja required more than skill, it demanded ritual purity. Artists would fast, meditate, and chant mantras before touching their chisels to stone, believing the sculpture emerged not from their hands but through them. The resulting dancing Shiva, with its cosmic flames and rhythmic pose, wasn't merely art, it was theology in bronze, a frozen moment of creation and destruction meant to awaken devotion in anyone who gazed upon it. Ritual also shaped what stories got told. Maya scribes painting codices didn't choose scenes at random. They recorded celestial events and sacred calendars, their vivid blues and reds serving as bridges between kings and gods. On Greek vases, Dionysian revels weren't just party scenes, they were visual hymns, their swirling figures acting out rituals that worshippers would recognize from actual festivals. Even the materials held meaning. Byzantine icon painters ground their pigments with egg yolk, symbolizing Christ's sacrifice in every stroke. What's fascinating is how these constraints often led to breathtaking innovation. Japanese Shinto artists carving wooden kami statues had to follow exact measurements for each deity, yet within those rules, they found ways to make the grain of the wood seem alive with divine energy. Tibetan mandalas, destroyed after completion to honor impermanence, turned ephemerality into part of their power. The tension between rigid tradition and transcendent beauty gave these works their timeless quality. They feel alive because they were made with the weight of belief behind every detail. So the next time you see an ancient ritual object in a museum case, remember, it wasn't meant to be viewed under glass. That Egyptian funerary mask was designed to catch the dim light of oil lamps in a tomb, its gold amplifying the flicker into something otherworldly. That Aztec turquoise mosaic wasn't just decorative, it mirrored the night sky, turning a ruler's shield into a piece of the cosmos. These artists weren't creating for posterity. They were creating for the divine moment, and somehow that's exactly what made their work last forever. Myths weren't just entertainment for ancient audiences, they were emotional blueprints, and artists held the power to make those invisible struggles visible. Look at the way Greek vase painters froze pivotal moments from legends, not the obvious climaxes but the heart-stopping instants just before or after. A cup by the Brygos painter shows Achilles slaying Penthesilea, but here's the genius their eyes meet as his sword strikes, capturing the tragic second the warrior realizes he's killed someone he might have loved. That wasn't incidental, it was a deliberate choice to spotlight the agony within violence, turning a mythic battle into a meditation on fate's cruel ironies. The Parthenon frieze takes this further by weaving myth into the fabric of daily life. Amidst the carved procession, gods and mortals stand shoulder to shoulder, their poses nearly identical, a visual declaration that Athenian citizens weren't just honoring deities but walking beside them. Notice how the sculptor placed the mythic sacrifice of Erechtheus' daughters beside actual Athenian maidens carrying ceremonial baskets. This juxtaposition wasn't decorative. It transformed a local legend into a civic mirror, suggesting every participant in the festival was reenacting sacred history. The frieze designers understood something profound. Myths resonate most when they feel less like distant tales and more like extensions of lived experience. Roman sarcophagi tell a different story through mythology. A 3rd century coffin might show Orpheus charming animals with his lyre, but twist the narrative instead of celebrating his musical gift. The carving emphasizes the moment Eurydice slips back into the underworld. The artist zoomed in on Orpheus' outstretched hand grasping empty air, a visceral metaphor for grief that any bereaved Roman would recognize. These weren't generic decorations, they were personalized consolations, using mythic failures to acknowledge human loss. Mesoamerican artists employed similar tactics with the Popolva's hero twins. On a Maya vase, the brothers don't just defeat the lords of Xibalba, they're shown playing ball game in the underworld, their athletic poses mirroring actual court rituals. By linking myth to a sport spectators knew intimately, the painter made cosmic battles feel immediate, suggesting every game reenacted divine struggles. What unites these examples is the artist's knack for emotional alchemy. Whether carving Norse runestones with Sigurd's dragon or painting Persephone's abduction in Etruscan tombs, they homed in on moments where divine stories intersected with universal human feelings, betrayal that stings like a personal wound, love that defies reason, sacrifice that aches with nobility. Their choices reveal what cultures valued most, not the gods' power, but how their stories helped mortals make sense of joy, terror, and everything in between. That's why these works still speak to us. They're not about ancient myths at all. They're about us, Ancient artists didn't just look at nature, they saw it as a living scripture, every leaf and stone brimming with hidden messages. Take the lotus flower rising from Nile mud in Egyptian temple carvings. Its daily cycle, submerged at night, reborn at dawn, wasn't merely botanical trivia. It became the ultimate metaphor for resurrection, shaping everything from tomb paintings to the columns that held up sacred roofs. But this wasn't passive imitation. By stylizing the lotus's petals into symmetrical perfection, artists transformed a common water plant into a celestial blueprint, proving nature wasn't just observed, it was rewritten in the language of the divine. Celtic artisans took a different approach with their endless knots. At first glance, those intricate metalwork swirls might seem purely decorative, until you realize they mirror oak branches twisting in wind or rivers converging, nature's chaos distilled into harmonious patterns. The famous Gundestrup cauldron doesn't just depict animals, it traps their energy in silver coils, turning wolves and serpents into visual incantations. What's revelatory is how these designs refuse to begin or end, echoing Celtic beliefs that life, death, and rebirth were one unbroken thread. The artists didn't copy nature's forms, they captured its rhythms, turning metal into a meditation on eternity. Materials themselves carried sacred weight. Indian sculptors chose soapstone for temple deities, not just for its softness under chisels, but because its cool touch evoked the tranquility of enlightenment. Chinese jade carvers prized the stone's muted tones and durability, seeing in its unyielding surface a metaphor for wisdom that outlasts empires. Even the marble quarried for Greek temples was selected for more than its whiteness. Veins running through Pentelic marble were thought to be the fingerprints of earth goddess Gaia, making each column a literal bridge between ground and sky. This symbolic alchemy extended to entire landscapes. The Maya didn't randomly place pyramids, they aligned them with solstice sunrises, turning architecture into a celestial clock. At Angkor Wat, the moat doesn't just encircle the temple, it replicates the Hindu cosmos with concentric rings mirroring mythical oceans around Mount Meru. By weaving geography into sacred geometry, these cultures didn't build on the land, they conversed with it, turning mountains into altars and rivers into consecration rituals. Perhaps most moving is how this nature-infused artistry honored the mundane alongside the magnificent. Much pottery paints squashes and beans with the same reverence reserved for gods, acknowledging agriculture as its own kind of miracle. In Japan's Shinto tradition, even a gnarled tree trunk could house a kami spirit, celebrated not despite its imperfections but because of them. That's the ultimate lesson from these ancient creators. Divinity wasn't separate from the dirt under their nails or the birds outside their windows. It was hiding in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered by anyone willing to look closely enough. Architecture wasn't just about shelter for ancient builders, it was a language spoken to the gods. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza, its sides aligned with near-perfect precision to the cardinal directions, a feat requiring knowledge of astronomy so advanced it still baffles engineers today. But this wasn't just technical showmanship. The pyramid's shafts pointed directly to stars like Sirius and Orion, tying the pharaoh's ascent to the heavens into the very bricks. Every measurement whispered a sacred equation. The slope of the walls mirrored the sun's rays, the chambers echoed the underworld's journey, and the apex became a ladder between earth and sky. The Greeks took this celestial conversation further with the Parthenon. Its columns might look straight to the naked eye, but they actually curve slightly inward, a technique called intosses, to counter optical illusions and create a sense of dynamic tension. The spacing between columns isn't uniform either. It contracts at the corners, pulling the eye upward as if the temple itself is breathing. And here's the revelation. These imperfections were calculated using the golden ratio, a mathematical proportion believed to reflect divine harmony. The architects weren't just building, they were composing a hymn in marble where every line sang in tune with cosmic order. Now shift your gaze to Cambodia's Angkor Wat. Its 5 towers don't just mimic Mount Meru, the Hindu axis of the universe, they replicate its exact mythical dimensions. The moat, that's the cosmic ocean. The galleries, the mountain ranges encircling creation. Walking through the complex becomes a pilgrimage through cosmology itself, with bas-reliefs of churning oceans and celestial dancers turning myth into walkable reality. What's staggering is the precision. During equinoxes, the sun rises directly over the central tower, a phenomenon that would have required generations of astronomical observation to orchestrate. Mesoamerican architects played the same game with deadly seriousness. El Castillo at Chichen Itza isn't just a pyramid, it's a celestial calendar in stone. Each of its 4 sides has 91 steps, totaling 364 when combined with the shared platform at the top. Add 1 for the day of the equinox, and you've got a solar year. But the real magic happens when the sun sets during spring and fall equinoxes. Shadows slither down the steps like a serpent, uniting with carved snake heads at the base. This wasn't decoration, it was Kukulkan, the feathered serpent god, descending to bless his people, engineered through angles and astronomy. Even Stonehenge, often reduced to a mysterious circle, reveals layers of intentionality. The heel stone aligns with the summer solstice sunrise, but lesser-known features like the Aubrey holes pits encircling the monument may have been used to predict lunar eclipses. The bluestones hauled from Wales weren't chosen randomly. Their acoustic properties suggest they might have been part of ritual soundscapes, turning the site into a sort of Neolithic surround system for sacred ceremonies. What ties these marvels together is their creators' shared conviction that buildings could do more than house bodies, they could shape destinies. Whether it's the way Borobudur's mandala-like stupas guide Buddhist pilgrims toward enlightenment, or how Gothic cathedrals used stained glass to fracture sunlight into divine narratives, these structures were never passive. They were active participants in humanity's oldest conversation, how to touch the infinite with mortal hands, and perhaps that's why they still awe us, not because we've outgrown their magic, but because we still recognize the longing etched into every stone. The rigid stance of an Egyptian statue isn't just artistic convention, it's a declaration of eternal order. Those forward-facing figures with 1 foot slightly advanced weren't frozen in motion. They were sculpted in readiness for the afterlife, their symmetrical limbs echoing the balance of Mat, the cosmic principle of truth and harmony. Even the proportions were sacred, measured in cubits based on the pharaoh's forearm, turning every royal statue into a physical manifestation of divine mathematics. But look closer and you'll spot the genius in their restraint, the slight arch of a back, the delicate curve of fingers holding a scepter, tiny humanizing details that kept these gods in stone from feeling cold or distant. Greek sculptors shattered this stillness with their celebration of motion. The Critios boy, that groundbreaking marble youth from the 5th century BCE, doesn't just stand, he shifts his weight onto one hip in a pose called contrapposto, making the marble seem to breathe. But this wasn't just anatomical showmanship. That subtle tilt of the pelvis and relaxed shoulder conveyed something radical. The idea that perfection could exist within naturalism, that gods might move among mortals not as rigid idols but as beings of effortless grace. The discus thrower by Myron takes it further, capturing a body coiled mid-action, every muscle taut yet harmonious, a visual ode to the Greek ideal that physical excellence mirrored spiritual nobility. What's fascinating is how these contrasting approaches served similar ends. Egyptian artists distilled the body into geometric purity to transcend human frailty, while Greeks exaggerated athletic proportions to suggest a higher state of being. Both cultures were answering the same question: how can flesh reflect the divine? The Kouros statues, those slender, smiling youths dotting archaic Greek sanctuaries, hold the answer in their enigmatic grins. Their braided hair and taut calves weren't just fashionable, they were codes signaling aristocratic virtue and the bloom of youth that Greeks associated with moral purity. To sculpt a beautiful body was to carve a prayer for divine favor, but ideals weren't universal. Contrast the voluptuous Venus of Willendorf with her Greek counterparts, where Aphrodite statues celebrated controlled elegance. This Paleolithic figurine's exaggerated curves spoke of fertility as raw, untamed power. Or consider the elongated heads of Mayan royalty, shaped in infancy to mimic corn gods, turning cranial binding into living art. Even in China's terracotta army, no two faces are alike, yet their unified posture broadcasts Qin Shi Huang's authority, proving individuality could coexist with imperial conformity. The true mastery lies in what these artists omitted. Greek sculptors left eyes unpainted, knowing blank marble orbs would catch light like living eyes in temple shadows. Egyptian reliefs showed faces in profile but torsos frontally, not because they couldn't depict perspective, but because this composite view captured the essence of each body part most recognizably. These weren't failures of skill, they were visual shortcuts to the sacred, stripping away realism to reveal a higher truth. When you stand before one of these works today, you're not just seeing a body, you're seeing how an entire civilization dreamed of transcending it. Death wasn't an end for ancient civilizations, it was a doorway, and artists held the keys. In Egypt's Valley of the Kings, tomb walls burst with color not to mourn but to navigate. The Book of the Dead wasn't literature, it was a visual GPS for the soul, its hieroglyphs and illustrations mapping every pitfall and demon in the Duat, the perilous underworld. Watch how artists depicted Anubis weighing hearts against the feather of Maat. This wasn't just judgment, it was theater, with the jackal god scales tilted slightly toward mercy, a silent reassurance to the deceased. Even the pigments whispered hope, greens symbolizing rebirth, golds echoing the flesh of gods, every hue a promise that death was just another kind of dawn. Etruscans took a strikingly different approach. Their sarcophagi often showed couples reclining as if at a banquet, their faces animated, hands holding cups or pomegranates, symbols of abundance and eternity. Unlike Egyptian solemnity, these figures laughed, their carved drapery swirling with life. The message was unmistakable. The afterlife wasn't a shadowy realm but a continuation of joy, where feasts never ended and love never faded. Notice how the husbands and wives are portrayed at their prime, regardless of actual age at death, art as wish fulfillment, granting eternal youth alongside immortality. But perhaps no culture blended dread and hope as vividly as the Maya. Their funeral vases show the maize god's cyclical resurrection, his body sprouting like a plant from cracks in the underworld. A ruler buried with such a vessel wasn't just interred with clay, he was given a visual incantation, a spell to mimic the god's rebirth. The artists hid clues in the details. The god's jewelry resembles corn kernels, his posture mirrors sprouting stalks, turning biology into theology. Even the vase's shape mattered, its rounded belly echoed the curve of the cosmos, making the vessel a miniature universe for the dead to carry into the next world. Chinese Han Dynasty artisans offered their own version of comfort. Jade burial suits woven with gold thread weren't mere extravagance, they were cosmic armor. Each polished stone piece was cut to mirror the constellations, transforming the body into a celestial map. The jade's cool touch was believed to slow decay, but its true power was symbolic. By encasing nobles in constellations, artists promised they'd travel not into darkness, but into the heavens themselves. The suit's precision, some with over 2,000 plaques, wasn't just craftsmanship, it was devotion, every hour spent fitting stones a prayer for safe passage. What unites these traditions is their shared refusal to let death have the final word. Whether through Osiris' triumph over dismemberment or Etruscan banquets stretching into eternity, artists weaponized beauty against despair. Their works ask us a daring question. What if dying isn't an ending but the ultimate creative act, a chance to paint your own resurrection in strokes of gold, jade, or laughter carved in stone? Step onto the sun-baked stones of an Assyrian palace, and you're not just walking through history, you're stepping into the world's first graphic novel. Those towering alabaster reliefs of King Ashurbanipal hunting lions aren't mere decoration, they're masterclasses in visual storytelling. Notice how the artist carved the chaos of the chase into a deliberate sequence. The lions emerging from tall grass, the king drawing his bow, the fatal arrow striking home, each moment frozen yet pulsing with motion. The secret lies in the composition. Overlapping figures create depth, while diagonal lines pull your eye along the narrative like an ancient tracking shot. This wasn't just art, it was cinema in stone. The Romans refined this technique into something even more sophisticated. Trajan's column spirals upward with over 2,000 figures, chronicling the emperor's Dacian wars in astonishing detail. But here's the brilliance: the reliefs aren't chronological. Key battles repeat at eye level, while quieter moments like troop movements climb higher, forcing viewers to circle the column as if rewinding and fast-forwarding through a campaign. The artist even played with scale. Trajan appears 59 times, his stature shrinking or growing to emphasize pivotal scenes. This wasn't just record-keeping, it was psychological manipulation, using stone to shape collective memory. Egyptian temple reliefs took a different approach to narrative compression. At Luxor, the Opet festival unfolds in stacked registers, gods carried in barks at the top, priests chanting below, dancers and offerings at the base. The scenes aren't separate, they're simultaneous, collapsing days of ritual into a single sacred instant. The artist used symbolic shorthand too. Repeated figures of the pharaoh smiting enemies aren't literal repetitions but visual echoes, reinforcing his eternal dominance. What's astonishing is how these ancient creators solved problems modern storytellers still grapple with. The Bayeux tapestry, technically an embroidery, uses embroidered borders like comic book panels, with vignettes of Norman ships building and battles raging framed by mythical beasts and farming scenes. The Maya did something similar at Bonampak, where murals wrap around rooms, immersing viewers in coronations and wars with blood-red backgrounds heightening the drama. These artists understood something fundamental about human cognition. We're wired to find patterns in chaos. When a Hittite sculptor carved storm gods trampling mountains, or a Chinese artisan depicted the Queen Mother of the West's paradise in layered jade, they were tapping into universal storytelling instincts. The reliefs work because they balance specificity, the curl of a lion's mane, the fold of a soldier's cloak, with enough ambiguity to let viewers fill gaps with their own imaginations. That's why they still captivate us today. They're not just telling stories, they're inviting us to co-create them. Music and dance ripple through ancient art like echoes of forgotten melodies, frozen in time yet somehow still alive. On Athenian vases, the curve of a lyre player's wrist isn't just anatomy, it's a pause between notes, the wood grain of the instrument carved with such precision you can almost hear the strings' vibration. The artists didn't merely paint musicians, they embedded rhythm into the composition itself. Notice how the figures often lean into their instruments, their drapery swirling as if stirred by the music they create. Even the negative space between dancers on a Greek crater becomes part of the performance, the gaps as charged with energy as the bodies themselves. Indian temple sculptors took this further with their depictions of Bharatanatyam dancers. A 12th century panel at Chidambaram doesn't just show a pose, it captures the split second before movement explodes. The dancer's bent knee and splayed fingers are mid-mudra, her ankle bells suspended in motion. The real genius lies in the base. Carved waves beneath her feet suggest her steps aren't just dance but creation, churning the cosmic ocean like Shiva Nataraja himself. These artists understood something profound. Stillness could imply motion if you carved the tension just right. Minoan frescoes from Crete play a different game with ephemerality. The famous bull leaping, seen at Knossos, freezes three bodies mid-vault, one gripping the bull's horns, another arched gracefully over its back, a third landing with outstretched arms. What looks like chaos is actually meticulous storytelling. The spirals framing the action mirror the bull's swirling energy, while the dancer's tapered waists and elongated limbs make them seem both weightless and powerful. This wasn't sport or entertainment, it was a sacred ritual, and the artist translated its adrenaline into visual poetry. Now look east to China's Tang Dynasty tomb figurines. These ceramic musicians don't just hold pipas and flutes, their cheeks puff with breath, their heads tilt toward one another as if listening for the next cue. The secret's in the asymmetry, a slightly raised eyebrow here, a finger not quite touching the instrument's fret there. These tiny imperfections make the scene thrum with life, convincing us the next note is about to sound. Even their postures tell stories. Foreign musicians sit cross-legged, their Central Asian features and exotic instruments broadcasting the Tang Empire's cosmopolitan reach. Perhaps no culture merged sound and stone more literally than the Maya. At Kapon, a hieroglyphic stairway depicts royal musicians with their instruments, but the real magic happens when sunlight hits the steps at dawn. The shadows transform static carvings into a flickering procession, as if the figures are marching and playing. Nearby, sculptures of dancing maize gods have hollow limbs that once rattled with clay beads, turning wind into percussion. These artists didn't represent music, they engineered it into the architecture itself. What unites these works across continents is their shared defiance of silence. Whether through an Etruscan fresco of Orlo's players with flushed cheeks or the way Byzantine mosaics make golden halos pulse like drumbeats, these creators found ways to make the eyes hear. Their legacy reminds us that art was never just about what you could see. It was about what you could feel vibrating in your bones long after the last note faded. Hercules wasn't just a strongman in ancient art. He was a walking billboard for cultural values. Greek sculptors carved him with muscles so defined they looked like topography. But those bulging biceps weren't just about brute force. Look closer at the Farnese Hercules. His weary pose, leaning on his club after the 12 labors, tells a deeper story. The sweat carved into his brow, the lion's skin slipping from his shoulder. This isn't invincibility, but exhaustion overcome. Greek artists were making a point. True heroism wasn't just strength, but perseverance. That slight slump in his posture, it humanized him, letting viewers think, if even Hercules struggles, maybe my own battles are worth fighting. Now contrast that with Mesopotamia's Gilgamesh, immortalized in palace reliefs gripping lions by their throats. His heroism wasn't about endurance but raw dominance. Kings commissioned these images to equate their rule with cosmic order. Notice how artists always showed him mid-action, never resting, his curls and beard coiled like storm clouds. This wasn't just mythology, it was political messaging. When an Assyrian craftsman inlaid Gilgamesh's figure into ivory plaques, he wasn't decorating furniture. he was turning every sip of wine at the royal table into a reminder of the king's godlike authority. Egypt took a radically different approach. Their hero wasn't a muscle-bound demigod but the slender, composed pharaoh. In temple reliefs at Abydos, Seti I smites enemies with elegant precision, his arm raised not in chaotic fury but in ritualistic calm. The artistry here lies in what's missing, no bulging veins or strained expressions. Pharaohs were divine chess players, conquering through strategic intellect rather than brute force. Even their idealized physiques, narrow waists, broad shoulders, mirrored the hieroglyph for perfect, turning the male form into a geometric prayer for balance. But heroism wasn't monolithic. In Minoan frescoes, lithe acrobats leap over bulls, their wiry frames celebrating agility over bulk. Their long hair flows mid-flip, catching the moment when courage meets grace. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Olmec colossal heads depicted rulers with jaguar-like snarls. Their flattened noses and thick lips weren't portraits but deliberate distortions, merging human leaders with the jungle's primal power. The most revealing twist comes from ancient China's terracotta warriors. These life-sized soldiers weren't clones. Their facial features vary as much as their armor. Some have laugh lines, others youthful smoothness, a silent declaration that heroism wasn't about conforming to one ideal, but standing together despite differences. The unglazed clay left its original earthy tone, whispers another truth. These weren't gods but men. What ties these depictions together is their shared understanding that masculinity in art was never just anatomy, it was allegory. Whether through Hercules' labors or Pharaoh's serene conquests, artists were asking the same question: what does it cost to be great? The answers changed with every culture, but the purpose didn't. These works weren't just showing heroes, they were teaching generations how to recognize and become them. Isis cradling Horus isn't just a mother and child, it's a revolution in stone. Egyptian artists depicted her throne-shaped headdress merging with the infant sun god, her lap becoming the horizon where each new day dawned. But here's what's extraordinary. While her posture radiates serenity, her grip on the sidelock of youth hints at something fiercer. This duality, nurturer and unshakable protector, wasn't accidental. Temple painters used precise color codes. Her green skin symbolized rebirth, while the red of her dress echoed the lifeblood of the Nile. Every detail whispered that femininity wasn't softness alone. It was the engine of creation itself. Now shift your gaze to Athena Parthenos, that colossal gold and ivory statue that once dominated the Acropolis. Greek sculptors showed her helmet pushed back, revealing calm features, but her spear and aegis cloak bristling with serpents told another story. The trick was in the material's ivory for her face, glowing like wisdom refined through struggle, while the gold of her armor reflected sunlight onto worshippers, literally illuminating them with divine insight. This wasn't just a war goddess, it was a visual manifesto that strategic brilliance belonged to the feminine sphere as much as the battlefield. Compare this to the Hindu goddess Durga, her 10 arms a whirlwind of divine agency. Indian bronze casters didn't depict her limbs as chaotic. Each weapon was meticulously spaced like the petals of a lotus, her foot forever frozen mid-victory over the buffalo demon. The genius lies in her expression, not rage but focused determination. By showing her face in perfect repose while her arms enacted cosmic justice, artists made a radical statement: feminine power could be simultaneously graceful and unstoppable. Minoan snake goddess figurines take the concept further. These bare-breasted figures gripping serpents weren't fertility charms, as often assumed. The snake's upraised heads mirror the goddess's poised stance, suggesting mastery over primal forces. Cretan artisans baked them from clay mixed with crushed seashells, so they'd gleam like the ocean under torchlight. This was femininity as raw, elemental authority, not bound by later Greek ideals of modesty, but vibrating with untamed sacred energy. Even in cultures where goddesses weren't central, feminine symbolism seeped into sacred art. Chinese jade carvings of the moon goddess Chang often show her holding a rabbit, its pounding heart echoing the lunar cycle. The pale stone was deliberately chosen to mimic moonlight, and if you turn these pendants just so, the rabbit's ears cast shadows resembling the crescent moon. Over in the Americas, Aztec sculptors carved Coatlicue with a skirt of twisted serpents and a necklace of human hands, not to horrify, but to visualize her as the consuming and regenerating earth. The real revelation, these depictions were never just about worship. When Athenian potters painted Artemis alongside hunting dogs, they were commenting on women's roles beyond marriage. When Egyptian midwives placed Isis figurines in birth chambers, they were asserting that the divine feminine presided over real, bodily experiences. These artists understood something we're still grappling with, that how a culture imagines its goddesses inevitably shapes how it sees its women. The quiet power in Isis's embrace, the strategic brilliance in Athena's gaze, the unapologetic force of Durga's arms, they weren't fantasies, they were mirrors held up to human potential, polished across centuries. The Sphinx crouching at Giza isn't just a lion with a pharaoh's face, it's a riddle carved in limestone. Egyptian artists didn't mix species randomly. Every hybrid creature was a deliberate cipher. That lion's body, raw power, poised to crush chaos. The human head, divine intellect, gazing eternally at the horizon where the sun god Ra rose each morning. Even the missing nose isn't vandalism, it's a silent testament to how these symbols were feared enough to be mutilated centuries later. But the true genius lies in the pause. They're not resting but tensed, as if the Sphinx could leap forward the moment cosmic balance faltered. This wasn't decoration, it was a guardian coded in anatomy. Now cross continents to China's dragons coiling across jade plaques and temple beams. Unlike Western fire breathers, these serpentine beings were rainbringers, their scales mirroring fish to emphasize their watery domain. Ming Dynasty artisans painted them with 5 claws, a privilege reserved for imperial motifs, while Korean versions had 4, and Japanese dragons 3. The message was clear: these weren't monsters but celestial bureaucrats, their claws counting their rank in the heavenly hierarchy. Watch how their whiskers flare like water reeds in current, their bodies twisting through clouds as if swimming through invisible rivers. To paint a dragon wasn't to depict a myth, it was to harness the rhythms of storms and seasons. The Aztecs took hybridization further with their feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. Turquoise mosaics gave his scales an eerie iridescence, while the Quetzal bird's emerald plumes became his literal namesake. But here's what most miss: the serpent doesn't just wear feathers, it becomes them. In temple reliefs, the scales gradually soften into plumage along its body, a visual metaphor for the union of earth and sky. When wind rattled the feathered rattles on ceremonial staffs, worshippers didn't just hear sound, they heard the god's voice hissing through time. Even creatures without fantastical traits carried cosmic weight. The owl perched on Athena's shoulder in Greek vases isn't a pet but a nocturnal prophet, its wide eyes seeing truth in darkness. Viking artisans twisted wolf motifs into intricate knotwork, their interlaced bodies symbolizing both destruction, Fenrir, and loyalty, Jerry and Freki. And let's not forget the Hindu Garuda, part eagle, part man, his golden wings spread wide enough to block the sun, not as a threat, but as a promise to carry devotees beyond suffering. What unites these creations is their refusal to be pinned down. A Mesopotamian lamassu, that winged bull with a human head, wasn't carved in profile by accident. From the front, it stood guard. From the side, it strode forward, defying physics to exist simultaneously as sentinel and herald. These artists understood that true power lies in ambiguity, in creatures that slip between categories as easily as dreams slip into waking life. So the next time you see an ancient griffin or chimera, don't ask what it is, ask what it's bridging. Because every hybrid beast was a passport between worlds, stamped with the hopes of those who dared to imagine them. Light and shadow weren't just elements of design in sacred spaces, they were the brushstrokes of the divine. Walk into the Hagia Sophia at dawn and watch how sunlight slants through the high windows, striking the gold mosaics to set the entire dome ablaze. This wasn't an accident. Byzantine architects positioned those windows precisely so the light would climb the walls like a living thing, mimicking the ascent of the soul toward heaven. The gold tessera didn't just reflect light, they fractured it, turning each beam into a shower of celestial sparks. And when clouds passed outside, the sudden dimming felt like a veil dropping between the earthly and the eternal, a reminder that the divine could withdraw as swiftly as it appeared. Egyptian tomb painters worked similar magic with far simpler tools. In the Valley of the Kings, burial chambers were deliberately narrow, their ceilings low. Why? So a single flickering torch would cast exaggerated shadows across the hieroglyphs, making gods and spirits seem to move on the walls. The artists painted with reflective pigments, ground calcite mixed into yellows and whites, so the flame's dance would animate Osiris's judgment or Ra's solar bark mid-journey. Even the placement of reliefs mattered. Figures were carved shallow on the west walls, deeper on the east, so as the sun crossed the sky, the shadows shifted to act out scenes of resurrection. This wasn't decoration, it was ritual theater engineered into stone. Gothic cathedrals took this interplay to staggering heights. Chartres' stained glass windows weren't mere illustrations, they were chromatic alchemy. Blue glass infused with cobalt absorbed red and yellow wavelengths, casting cool azure light that symbolized the Virgin's purity. Reds, rich with copper, glowed like embers, evoking the Holy Spirit's fire. But the real genius lay in the lead coming between glass pieces. On overcast days, these lines thickened into bold black strokes, turning biblical scenes into stark graphic narratives. Then, when the sun burst through, the leads vanished and the glass seemed to float in midair, a visual metaphor for faith transcending earthly constraints. Mesoamerican architects orchestrated light with equal precision. At Chichen Itza's El Castillo, the equinox sunrise transforms the pyramid's northwest corner into a serrated edge, casting triangular shadows that slither down the steps to unite with serpent heads at the base. But lesser known is the interior temple, where a single shaft of light penetrates twice a year, illuminating a hidden jaguar throne with spots of gold inlay that ignite like stars in a midnight sky. The Maya didn't just observe celestial events, they built them into the fabric of worship, turning stone into a cosmic clock. Even in rock-cut temples like India's Ellora, light was sculpted as carefully as the statues. The Kailasa temple's courtyard funnels sunlight into a narrow beam that travels across Shiva's face in winter, pausing at noon to crown the lingam with radiance. The carving's depth varies imperceptibly, a millimeter deeper here, shallower there, to stretch this moment into a lingering epiphany. Meanwhile, in Japan's Eye's grand shrine, reed screens filter sunlight into ever-shifting patterns, embodying Shinto beliefs in nature's transient beauty. What ties these traditions together is their shared understanding that light wasn't illumination, it was revelation. Whether through the way Bronze Age stone circles channeled solstice rays onto altar stones, or how Islamic muqarnas diffused light into geometric fractals, these artists didn't work with shadow. They worked with time, with theology, with the human pulse quickening at the touch of the inexplicable. Their spaces weren't just lit, they were alive. Assyrian palace walls didn't just depict battles, they weaponized perspective to make violence feel inevitable. Take the siege scenes at Nineveh, where archers rain arrows from impossibly high walls, their victims tumbling in chaotic heaps below. The artists carved the Assyrian soldiers larger than their enemies, not just to show dominance but to warp reality itself, turning conquest into a cosmic certainty. Yet look closer and you'll spot the subtleties: a fallen horse's twisted neck, a defender's hand clutching a wound, tiny moments of suffering woven into the propaganda. This wasn't just art, it was psychological warfare designed to awe subjects and terrify rebels with equal force. Roman triumphal columns took a different approach, turning war into a sprawling epic. Trajan's column doesn't just show victories, it lingers on the mundane. Legionnaires build forts, tend wounds, even gather firewood between clashes. These quiet moments serve a cunning purpose. They make the eventual battles feel earned, the bloodshed justified. Notice how the enemies are never faceless hordes. Dacian warriors mourn their dead, their grief carved with the same care as Roman valor. The message is clear: Rome's glory wasn't cheap, and its artists refused to let viewers forget the price. Greek vase painters went further, exposing war's emotional toll. A 6th century BC amphora shows Achilles bandaging Patroclus' arm, their helmets discarded, their faces inches apart. The scene isn't from the Iliad, it's an intimate invention, revealing what Homer left unsaid. The brushstrokes capture Patroclus' wince and Achilles' tenderness, transforming myth into a meditation on love and loss. Even the vase's shape plays a role. Its curved belly echoes the protective hunch of Achilles' shoulders, making the container itself part of the story. But perhaps no culture balanced war's duality like the Maya. Their murals at Bonampak don't shy from brutality. Captives beg as their fingernails are torn out, yet the compositions pulse with strange beauty. The artists used vibrant turquoise and cochineal red, turning screams into color theory. The victors loom in jaguar pelts, but their finery can't hide their exhaustion. One warrior slumps against a wall, his ornate headdress askew, his face hollow with fatigue. This is war without illusion, glorious in triumph, unbearable in cost. What unites these works is their refusal to simplify. The Assyrians carved terror but left room for pity. The Romans celebrated empire yet honored their foes. The Greeks turned heroes into lovers. The Maya painted splendor over suffering. These artists understood that war's truth lies in contradictions, that to depict it honestly, you must hold both the shining sword and the hand that trembles beneath its weight. A Greek sculptor working in the shadows of the Hindu Kush mountains might seem improbable until you see the evidence carved into stone. The Buddha statues of Gandhara stand as elegant hybrids, their wavy hair and draped robes unmistakably Greek, their serene expressions and elongated earlobes pure Indian spirituality. This wasn't coincidence, it was commerce in action. When Alexander's armies marched into Central Asia, they didn't just bring soldiers, they carried an artistic revolution in their supply trains. Local artisans in what's now Pakistan blended Hellenistic realism with Buddhist iconography, creating figures that felt both divinely transcendent and humanly approachable. Notice how the folds of the Buddha's robe cling like wet drapery, a technique lifted straight from Athenian workshops, yet the lotus throne beneath him roots the statue firmly in South Asian soil. Meanwhile, in Egypt's bustling port cities, Persian motifs crept into temple designs under Achaemenid rule. Look closely at the capitals of columns in Memphis, where lotus blossoms once stood alone. Now they twine with Persian palmettes. their curling fronds a silent testament to cultural negotiation. Even colors traveled. The vibrant turquoise glaze on Egyptian amulets owes its brilliance to Mesopotamian cobalt recipes traded along caravan routes. This wasn't appropriation, it was a creative dialogue where artisans borrowed, adapted, and improved upon what they encountered. The Silk Road became the ultimate artistic melting pot. A Chinese lacquer box unearthed in Siberia bears motifs of grapevines, a plant foreign to East Asia, but beloved by Mediterranean cultures. The vines twist around the box in rhythmic spirals that feel distinctly Chinese, proving trade wasn't just about exchanging goods but visual vocabularies. Over in Rome, wealthy patricians sipped from goblets decorated with Indian ivory inlays, their exotic patterns sparking fashion trends that rippled through workshops from Gaul to Greece. Perhaps no object captures this cross-pollination better than the Tilia Teep golden hoard from Afghanistan. A nomadic chieftain's burial yielded Greek-inspired Eros figurines wearing Chinese-style trousers, their wings adorned with Siberian animal motifs. The goldsmith didn't see contradictions, only possibilities. Every stitch of cultural influence strengthened the fabric of their art. These exchanges didn't dilute traditions, they amplified them. When Phoenician glassmakers taught their techniques to Egyptian craftsmen, the result wasn't imitation but innovation. The brilliant blues of Alexandria's glassware soon surpassed anything made in Tyre. Indian temple sculptors absorbed Greco-Roman naturalism, then pushed it further, capturing the flutter of silk saris in stone with a dynamism that would make a Parthenon carver gasp. The ancient world's greatest masterpieces weren't born in isolation. They were the children of countless conversations, whispered across deserts and seas in the universal language of beauty. In ancient Greece, a sculptor's signature chiseled into a statue's base wasn't just pride, it was a revolution. Names like Phidias and Praxiteles echoed through workshops, their reputations as prized as the marble they carved. These weren't mere laborers, they were intellectual celebrities, invited to philosophize with aristocrats and paid fortunes to capture gods in stone. A single glance at the Delphi charioteer reveals why. The delicate veins in the hands, the slight part of the lips details so lifelike they whispered the artist's genius. But this reverence wasn't universal. Cross the Mediterranean to Egypt, and you'll search in vain for a painter's mark on tomb walls. Here, artists were hemu, craftsmen, their individual identities dissolved into the collective effort of serving pharaoh and gods. Their workshops lay hidden behind temple walls, their tools consecrated in rituals that framed creativity as divine service rather than personal expression. The contrast couldn't be starker. Greek vase painters spun myths into visual dramas, adding cheeky details, a satyr peeking around a column, a god's exasperated eye roll that showcased their wit. Meanwhile, Egyptian artisans followed the canon of proportions, a strict grid system where even the width of a foot was mathematically prescribed. Deviate, and you risk disrupting the cosmic order. Yet anonymity didn't mean mediocrity. Look at the sorrow in Queen Nefertari's painted eyes or the golden ripple of Tutankhamun's funerary mask. These works thrum with quiet mastery, proving that constraint could breed brilliance. China's imperial workshops offer a fascinating middle ground. While most artisans remained unnamed, a select few like the Tang Dynasty ceramicist Xing, whose secret color glazes were coveted by emperors, achieved legendary status. Their fame came with a catch: perfect a technique, and you might spend decades replicating it exclusively for the throne. Creativity was rewarded, but only if it served power. What's revelatory is how these societal attitudes shaped the art itself. Greek sculptors, buoyed by prestige, experimented with daring contrapposto poses that made marble seem to breathe. In contrast, Assyrian relief carvers, though technically brilliant, repeated near-identical war scenes for centuries, their individuality suppressed to amplify royal propaganda. Even in Mesoamerica, Maya scribes painted intricate codices but rarely signed them, their artistry funneled into preserving dynastic histories rather than personal legacies. Yet exceptions abound. In the caves of Ajanta, Indian muralists left behind palm prints in pigment, a fleeting "I was here" amid scenes of Buddha's lives. And in Rome, freedmen artists like Famulus signed Pompeii's frescoes, their brushstrokes dancing between mythological decor and sly social commentary. A parrot perched on a noblewoman's wrist might cost extra, a wink to patrons who valued status symbols over subtlety. The truth is, ancient artists existed in a paradox, both invisible and indispensable. Whether named or nameless, they held the mirror to their societies, reflecting what cultures valued, be it individual genius, divine order, or imperial glory. Their legacy isn't just in the works they left behind, but in the silent choices they made, to conform or rebel, to vanish into tradition or etch their presence into history. And that's the real masterpiece, not just what they created, but how they navigated the weight of expectation to leave something enduring behind. The Greeks didn't just carve statues, they engineered illusions. That subtle shift of weight in the Critios boy, one hip slightly raised, the shoulders tilting in response, this contrapposto technique wasn't merely about realism. It was a silent rebellion against the rigid symmetry of earlier eras, a way to make marble breathe. Artists discovered that by offsetting the body's axes, they could capture the tension of a moment frozen mid-motion, as if the figure might step off its pedestal if you blinked. But the real mastery lay in the imperfections, the left side slightly relaxed, the right subtly engaged, mirroring how living bodies actually move. This anatomical lie told a deeper truth, that perfection could pulse with life. Meanwhile, in Rome, builders were mixing volcanic ash with lime to create a revolution in liquid stone. Concrete didn't just allow for grander arches and domes, it transformed storytelling. The Pantheon's oculus wasn't merely an architectural marvel, it was a celestial clock beam, slicing through the rotunda to trace the sun's path across deities embedded in the walls. Suddenly, art wasn't confined to surfaces. It enveloped viewers, pulling them into immersive narratives where painted skies melted into real sunlight. Roman frescoists exploited this new canvas, layering wet plaster and pigments to bond colors chemically with the wall. The Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii proves their genius. 2,000 years later, its reds still vibrate because they're not painted on the wall, they're fused into its very skin. Egypt's grid system reveals another kind of innovation: mathematics as artistic tool. Before chisel touched stone, artisans ruled surfaces with precise red lines, dividing figures into 18 equal units from hairline to toe. This wasn't restrictive, it was liberating. By standardizing proportions, artists could focus on nuance, the curve of a queen's necklace, the hieroglyphs subtly integrated into a god's headdress. Their brushes, made from chewed reed fibers, allowed strokes so fine they could render falcon feathers on a sarcophagus with microscopic precision. Even their blue pigment, derived from grinding imported lapis lazuli, was a technological marvel, the first synthetic color created through chemistry rather than found in nature. Halfway across the world, Chinese potters were turning kilns into alchemical laboratories. By the Tang dynasty, they'd mastered reduction firing, starving the flame of oxygen at critical moments to transform iron-rich clays into celestial greens and blues. The famous tri-colored glazes of camels and dancers weren't just decorative. Their swirling hues mimicked the cosmic interplay of yin and yang. And let's not forget the Roman glassmakers who discovered that adding manganese could neutralize unwanted green tints, producing vessels so clear they rivaled rock crystal, a technique lost for centuries after the empire's fall. What's astonishing is how these innovations served deeper narratives. Greek vase painters developed the red figure technique not just for aesthetic novelty, but to render emotion with unprecedented subtlety. The downcast eyes of a departing warrior, the tense muscles of a discus thrower. Assyrian sculptors used drill bits to undercut stone, creating shadows that made lion hunts leap off palace walls. Even something as simple as the Maya's use of reflective mica in stucco murals turned temples into shimmering visions of the underworld when torchlight hit them. These weren't just technical feats, they were bridges between the tangible and the transcendent. When an Egyptian artist mixed gum Arabic into pigment to achieve translucent washes for sunset skies, or a Byzantine mosaicist set tesserae at precise angles to catch candlelight, they weren't showing off. They were reaching for something beyond skill, a way to make stone sigh, paint sing, and mortal hands touch the divine. The tools changed, but the quest remained, to trap the ineffable in the palm of human creation. When the standard of Ur's mosaic panels shimmered under torchlight in ancient Sumer, they weren't just telling stories, they were rewriting history. On the war side, chariots roll over enemies in perfect formation, the king towering 3 times larger than his soldiers. But here's what's fascinating, the artist embedded subtle contradictions. Among the orderly ranks, a wounded enemy clutches a spear, his face contorted in pain, an unexpected moment of humanity in what should have been pure glorification. This tension between propaganda and truth runs through centuries of royal art. Augustus didn't just want statues, he demanded eternal youth. Dozens of portraits show him with the same ageless face, smooth and idealized, whether he was 20 or 70. Yet the sculptors smuggled in realism where it mattered, the furrowed brow hinting at the burdens of rule, the slight downturn of lips suggesting weariness behind the mask of divinity. Persian kings took a different tack at Persepolis. Their reliefs of subject nations bringing tribute seem like straightforward power displays until you notice the details. The Lydians carried delicate vessels, the Armenians lead stallions, each group's gifts reflecting their unique strengths. Its conquest recast as collaboration, the artist's way of softening imperial domination with a veneer of mutual respect. The real stroke of genius, the carvers gave every figure distinct ethnic features and clothing, turning what could have been generic captives into a diplomatic tableau. But not all rulers favored subtlety. Assyrian palace walls screamed dominance with graphic precision. King Ashurbanipal's lion hunt reliefs didn't just show victory, they lingered on dying beasts, their entrails spilling as arrows protruded from their flanks. The message was brutal, resistance equals evisceration, yet even here, artists snuck in subversion. One lion, moments from death, turns its head to snarl defiantly, its muscles coiled in perfect tension. It's too magnificent to be mere prey, a silent protest against the very narrative it's forced to serve. Perhaps the most sophisticated balancing act occurred in Renaissance-era rediscoveries of ancient propaganda techniques. When Michelangelo carved David for Florence's ruling Medicis, he borrowed Augustus' playbook, the idealized youth, the flawless form. But that tensed neck vein and gripping hand tell another story. This isn't just a hero, but a thinker weighing the cost of violence. The statue's original placement sealed the deal facing Rome, a marble warning against tyranny. These artists walked a razor's edge, too compliant, and their work became hollow spectacle. Too rebellious, and they risked their heads. Their solution: layer the propaganda like palimpsests, letting the keen-eyed glimpse truths beneath the official version. That's why these pieces still captivate us, not as blunt tools of control, but as silent battles between power and integrity, frozen in stone for us to decode. That Renaissance sculptor poring over unearthed Roman statues wasn't just admiring antiquity, he was witnessing the rebirth of an artistic language. Michelangelo's David may be marble, but its contrapposto stance and hyperrealistic anatomy are direct descendants of Greek bronzes lost to time. Even the flicker of uncertainty in David's brow, that very human hesitation before battle, echoes the emotional complexity Hellenistic artists carved into Laocoon's anguished face. This wasn't imitation, it was a conversation across centuries where ancient techniques became tools to express contemporary ideals. Fast forward to the 19th century, when the pre-Raphaelites mined medieval and classical motifs for their vivid storytelling. John William Waterhouse's Hylas and the Nymphs doesn't just borrow a Greek myth, it amplifies its haunting sensuality through jewel-toned palettes inspired by Pompeian frescoes. The nymphs' translucent skin and submerged limbs mirror the erotic tension of ancient vase paintings, but with a Victorian psychological intensity that would have startled the ancients. Meanwhile, in Mexico, Frida Kahlo embedded Aztec symbolism into her self-portraits, transforming the mythical goddess Coyolxauhqui, dismembered by her brother Huitzilopochtli, into a raw metaphor for her own physical and emotional fractures. Modern architecture whispers these ancient dialogues too. The Lincoln Memorial's towering columns and enthroned figure channel the Parthenon's democratic grandeur, while Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial subverts that tradition with its stark, subterranean a wound in the earth as profound as any Greek tragic chorus. Even digital artists now remix antiquity. Kehinde Wiley's portraits wrap contemporary black figures in Baroque florals and Yoruba patterns, merging Renaissance grandeur with African traditions in a defiant reclamation of who gets to embody glory. Street art proves these themes aren't confined to galleries. Banksy's Mediterranean Migration reimagines the iconic Syrian boy from the Trojan War mosaics, washed ashore ancient tragedy colliding with modern crisis. The mural's cracked plaster and peeling edges mimic weathered ruins, forcing viewers to confront how little has changed in 3 millennia. Similarly, JR's colossal photo installations on pyramids and colosseums don't just adorn ancient sites. They transform them into canvases for modern stories, proving these spaces still pulse with relevance. What's mesmerizing is how ancient symbols mutate in contemporary hands. The Ouroboros, that Egyptian serpent eating its tail, now symbolizes climate activism as a loop of consumption and consequence. Athena's owl, once a symbol of wisdom, gets recast in feminist art as a shield against patriarchal systems. Even the humble Greek meander pattern, once a decorative border, now encodes binary data in public installations, linking the infinity loops of antiquity with digital eternity. These threads weave through pop culture too. Marvel's Black Panther costumes blend Benin bronze textures with Afrofuturism, while video games like Hades reinvent Greek myths with queer relationships the ancients might have recognized after all. Achilles and Patroclus' bond was hardly platonic. Ancient art's real legacy isn't in static imitation, but in its endless adaptability. Every time a painter references Caravaggio's chiaroscuro, itself borrowed from Roman wall paintings, or a filmmaker frames a hero like a Mesopotamian king trampling enemies, they're not copying, they're continuing a dialogue that began when the first artist mixed pigment with something deeper than water, the human need to make meaning visible. The true power of these ancient motifs lies in their unfinished nature. Like a fresco where later hands repaint sections across generations, their stories remain open-ended. When a 21st century ceramicist shapes a vase with Minoan octopus motifs but glazes it in neon, or a poet compares smartphone addiction to Pandora's box, they're not reviving the past. They're proving its themes were never really buried, just waiting for new voices to give them fresh breath. Stonehenge's towering stones have stood for millennia, yet their true purpose remains one of art history's most tantalizing riddles. Were they an astronomical calendar tracking solstices with uncanny precision? A healing site where the blue stone's alleged properties cured ailments? Or perhaps a Neolithic cathedral, its concentric circles echoing the cycles of life and death? The mystery deepens when you consider the blue stone's origin, dragged over 200 kilometers from Wales, an unimaginable feat for a pre-wheel society. Modern laser scans reveal something even stranger: hidden carvings of daggers and axes, their meanings lost to time. Each new discovery, like the recent unearthing of a vast ring of pits nearby, doesn't clarify Stonehenge's story. It adds more chapters to a book we're still learning to read. Then there's the enigma of the Minoan frescoes from Knossos. Those vibrant dolphins leaping across azure backgrounds seem straightforward until you notice the eerie, almost modern abstraction of their forms. Why do some figures have exaggerated, almond-shaped eyes that pierce across centuries with unsettling intensity? The famous Prince of the Lilies fresco compounds the puzzle. His crown of peacock feathers and serene expression suggest divinity, but recent pigment analysis reveals his skin was originally painted red, a color typically reserved for women in Minoan art. Was this a gender-fluid deity, a misidentified priestess, or evidence of a ritual role we've yet to comprehend? The more we study these fragments, the more they defy our assumptions. Consider the Nazca lines, those colossal geoglyphs scraped into Peru's desert floor. For decades, theories ranged from alien landing strips to celestial maps, until archaeologists discovered miniature versions on pottery and textiles. This suggests the lines weren't meant to be seen from above but were walked as ritual pathways, their massive scale a devotional act. Yet the mystery persists. Why depict a hummingbird nearly the length of a football field, or a spider with one leg elongated to precise astronomical alignments? Even supposedly understood artworks hide layers of ambiguity. The terracotta army's life-sized soldiers were hailed as a straightforward funerary guard, until chemical analysis showed their original paints contained precious purple from distant mollusks, hinting at trade networks far vaster than historians imagined. The Lascaux cave paintings, once seen as simple hunting magic, now provoke debates about shamanic visions, with their overlapping beasts and geometric signs possibly mapping altered states of consciousness. What's thrilling is how technology peels back these layers. Multispectral imaging on Egyptian papyri has uncovered erased texts rewriting dynastic histories, while 3D modeling of Mayan reliefs exposes hidden battle scenes beneath later propaganda. Each breakthrough feels like decoding a message from the past, only to realize it's written in a dialect we've barely begun to grasp. These gaps in knowledge aren't failures, they're invitations. They remind us that ancient art wasn't made to be solved like a crossword puzzle, but to resonate across time, shifting meaning with every generation that encounters it. The real magic lies not in the answers we find, but in the questions we're bold enough to keep asking. Ancient artists didn't just shape stone or mix pigments, they bottled lightning. Every brushstroke, every chisel mark was an attempt to pin down the intangible. The surge of triumph after victory, the ache of loss, the quiet awe of standing before something greater than oneself. What's astonishing isn't just that they succeeded, but how their works still resonate across centuries, as if the emotions they captured were etched not just in clay or gold, but in the very DNA of what it means to be human. Take the tiny details that bridge time like a secret handshake. The way a Sumerian sculptor carved a mother's hand cradling her child's head with the same tenderness you'd see in a modern photograph. Or the raw grief in the twist of a Roman sarcophagus figure, a posture so universal it needs no translation. These artists didn't have our technology, but they possessed something more potent, an unflinching eye for the moments that define us. That Minoan fresco of a fisherman grinning as he carries his catch. It's not the fish that matters, but the pride in his shoulders, the joy of a hard day's work that any delivery driver or barrister today would recognize instantly. Yet their genius went deeper than realism. They distilled chaos into symbols that bypass logic and speak directly to the soul. The Egyptian ankh, the Greek meander, the Celtic spiral, these weren't just decorations but visual shorthand for concepts too vast for words. When a Byzantine mosaicist set 1,000 gold tesserae to shimmer like divine light, or a Maya scribe painted the maize god's resurrection as both plant and human, they were building bridges between the seen and unseen, crafting maps for journeys we're all still taking. What's humbling is realizing these creators never knew their work would endure. The potter painting Achilles' sorrow on a vessel meant for wine, the stonemason carving a laughing Etruscan couple for a tomb. They weren't making art history. They were simply reaching for truth with the tools they had. And somehow, against all odds, their whispers survived empires crumbling and languages fading, waiting patiently for us to lean closer and listen. Now the question turns to us. In an age of digital ephemera where a masterpiece can be scrolled past in seconds, what will our descendants hold up as mirrors to their own lives? Maybe it won't be marble or frescoes, but the way a filmmaker framed grief in flickering pixels, or how a street artist turned a crumbling wall into a protest that stung like prophecy. The mediums change, but the mission remains, to carve our wonder and wounds into something that outlasts us. Standing before an ancient artwork isn't passive, it's an act of time travel. The artist stretches across the centuries, offering you their hand. Will you take it? Because every time we recognize ourselves in those weathered faces, every time a 4,000-year-old joke still makes us laugh, we prove their greatest hope that the things which make us human are stronger than time